The stagecoach rattled away into the frozen dawn, leaving Sarah Dalton standing alone on the wind-swept platform with nothing but a worn carpetbag and the bitter taste of exile in her mouth. But she did not know that 70 miles behind her, a cowboy named William Turner was already saddling his fastest horse with a desperate kind of purpose that would change both their lives forever. Sarah pulled her threadbare shawl tighter against the January wind that howled through Westcliff, Colorado, like a living thing intent on freezing her solid. The morning sun hung pale and useless in the iron-gray sky, offering no warmth to the small mining town nestled in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Her aunt and uncle had put her on that eastbound stage with barely a word of farewell, their faces hard with judgment and disappointment. They said she had brought shame to their household, that her behavior with William Turner had been inappropriate for an unmarried woman, that the gossip was destroying their standing in the community. None of it was true, not really, but truth seemed to matter little when measured against the sharp tongues of proper society ladies, who had nothing better to do than speculate about a young woman who dared to laugh too freely or speak her mind too openly. She had lived with her aunt and uncle for 3 years, ever since her parents died of fever back in Kansas. At 22 years old, Sarah had hoped to make a life for herself in Colorado, perhaps teaching at the schoolhouse or working at the general store. Instead, she found herself being shipped off to distant cousins in St. Louis, people she had never met, who had agreed to take her in out of family obligation rather than genuine affection. The thought of it made her chest tighten with a grief so profound she could barely breathe. But worse than the exile itself was leaving William behind without even a chance to say goodbye. William Turner worked at the Silver Star Ranch just outside of town, managing cattle and breaking horses with a skill that had earned him respect throughout the territory. He was 25, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of summer grass, and when he smiled at Sarah, it felt like the whole world suddenly made sense. They had met 6 months ago when she came to the ranch to deliver preserves her aunt had sold to the owner's wife. William had been in the corral working with a spirited paint mare, moving with such natural grace and patience that Sarah found herself transfixed. When he noticed her watching, he tipped his hat and called out something about the weather that made her laugh, though she could not later remember what he had said, only how his voice had sounded, warm and genuine, and entirely without pretense. After that, they found excuses to see each other whenever possible. William would ride into town on his days off, timing his visits to coincide with Sarah's errands. They would walk together along the creek when the weather was fine, talking about everything and nothing, discovering shared dreams and parallel sorrows. William had lost his parents young too, killed by raiders when he was just 14. He had survived on his own, working ranches across the territory, learning to rely on no one but himself. Yet with Sarah, he opened up in ways he never had before, sharing hopes of someday owning his own spread of land, raising horses and maybe a family if he found the right woman. Sarah had known for months that she was falling in love with him, but she had been too afraid to acknowledge it fully, knowing her aunt and uncle would never approve of a match with a ranch hand who had nothing but his wages and his reputation. When William kissed her 3 weeks ago behind the church after the Christmas social, Sarah felt her entire future shift and realign around that single perfect moment. He had pulled back, searching her face in the moonlight, and asked if he could speak to her uncle about courting her properly. She had said yes without hesitation, her heart so full she thought it might burst. But before William could make his formal request, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the banker's wife and the most vicious gossip in 3 counties, saw them walking together on the edge of town, and invented an entire scandal from nothing more than two people holding hands. By the time the story reached Sarah's aunt, it had transformed into something ugly and untrue. Her aunt confronted her that very evening, refusing to listen to reason or explanation, and her uncle made the decision immediately that Sarah would be sent away to St. Louis, where she could not cause any further damage to their reputation. Sarah tried to get word to William, but her aunt watched her constantly those final days, and when she attempted to slip out one evening, her uncle caught her and locked her in her room. She spent the night before her departure sitting at the window, hoping desperately that William would somehow appear, but he never came because he did not know she was leaving. Now she stood on this frozen platform watching the stagecoach disappear into the distance, and she felt something inside her begin to crack. The stage would not leave for St. Louis until tomorrow from Denver, which meant another day of travel by coach through the mountain passes. She had a connection to catch in 2 days that would take her east across the plains. Once she reached Missouri, there would be no way back, no chance of returning to Colorado or the life she had just begun to build here. A tear froze on her cheek before she could wipe it away. She turned toward the small boarding house where she was supposed to wait for the Denver coach, her feet numb in her worn boots, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming fast up the main street. Sarah looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. William Turner rode toward her like something out of a dream, his big bay gelding throwing up clouds of powdered snow with each stride. He wore his heavy winter coat and his hat pulled low, but she would have recognized him anywhere, in any weather, in any circumstance. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. William pulled his horse to a sliding stop in front of the platform and swung down from the saddle before the animal had fully halted. His face was raw from the cold, and from riding hard, his eyes fierce and searching. "Sarah," he said, and just her name in his voice made her knees weak. "Sarah, I just heard this morning from the postmaster. He told me your aunt sent you away, that you left on the dawn coach. I rode as fast as I could." She could not find words. Everything she wanted to say jammed up in her throat, until all she could do was stare at him. This man who had followed her into the bitter cold without hesitation. William climbed up onto the platform and stood before her, close enough that she could see the fear and determination warring in his expression. "Come back," he said roughly. "Please, Sarah, come back. You belong with me." The simple truth of those words broke something open inside her. "I cannot," she whispered. "My aunt and uncle will not allow it. They think I have disgraced them. They will not let me return to their house." "Then do not go back to their house," William said. He reached out and took her cold hands in his, warming them with his calloused palms. "Come back with me. Marry me, Sarah. I do not have much, just my wages and a small piece of land I have been saving for, but I will work every day of my life to give you everything you deserve. I should have asked you proper weeks ago. I should have gone to your uncle immediately and made my intentions clear, but I wanted to have more to offer you first. I was a fool to wait." Sarah's heart felt too large for her chest. "They will never give their blessing. My aunt has already made it clear what she thinks of you, of us." "I do not care about their blessing," William said fiercely. "I care about you. I care about building a life with you. You are 22 years old, Sarah. You do not need their permission to choose your own future. I am asking you to choose me, choose us." She looked into his face, at this good man who had ridden through the freezing dawn to find her, who was offering her everything he had, who was asking her to take the most terrifying leap of faith she had ever faced. In that moment, Sarah realized that she had been given a gift, not a tragedy. Her exile had freed her from the obligation of her aunt and uncle's approval. She was already cast out, already labeled improper and inappropriate. She had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "Yes," she said, and the word came out strong and clear despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will marry you, William Turner. I will come back with you. I choose you. I choose us." The joy that broke across William's face was like the sun emerging from behind winter clouds. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could feel his heart pounding against her own. "Thank you," he murmured into her hair. "Thank you, Sarah. I promise you will not regret this." "I know I will not," she said against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and wood smoke and something indefinably William. They stood like that for a long moment while the wind howled around them and the morning light grew gradually stronger. Then William pulled back and looked at her seriously. "We need to go now, before the next stage comes through and someone tries to stop us. There is a preacher in Silver Cliff, just 10 miles north. He is a good man, known him for years. He will marry us today if we ask." Sarah nodded, her decision made. She picked up her carpetbag and let William help her onto his horse, settling sideways in front of the saddle. He mounted behind her and wrapped one arm securely around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. The warmth of him seeped through her thin coat, chasing away the worst of the cold. "Hold tight," William said, and urged the bay into an easy lope out of town, heading north toward Silver Cliff. They rode in silence for the first few miles, both of them processing the enormity of what had just happened and what was about to happen. The landscape around them was harsh and beautiful, snow-covered valleys giving way to pine-studded slopes, the mountains rising stark and magnificent against the pale sky. Sarah had never felt more alive than she did in this moment, riding through the wilderness with the man she loved, choosing her own fate for the first time in her life. "Tell me about this land you have been saving for," Sarah said after a while, wanting to hear his voice, wanting to know about the future they would build together. William's arm tightened around her waist. "It is 160 acres about 15 miles west of Westcliff, up in the valley where Grape Creek runs down from the mountains. There is good grazing and timber, a natural spring that never freezes, and a meadow that floods gold with wildflowers come summer. I have been putting away every spare dollar for 3 years, and I finally have enough to make the down payment. I was going to finalize the purchase this spring." "It sounds beautiful," Sarah said softly. "It is the most beautiful place I have ever seen," William agreed. "Except maybe not quite as beautiful as you." Sarah felt her cheeks warm despite the cold. "You are a terrible flirt, William Turner." "Only with you," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Only ever with you." They reached Silver Cliff just before noon. The town was smaller than Westcliff, little more than a cluster of buildings serving the silver mines that dotted the surrounding hills. William knew exactly where he was going, guiding his horse through the snowy streets to a modest white church at the edge of town. A small cabin stood beside it, smoke rising from the chimney. William helped Sarah down and then tied his horse to the hitching post. He took her hand and together they walked to the cabin door. William knocked, and a moment later it swung open to reveal a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair. "Reverend Matthews," William said, "I hope I am not disturbing you, but I have urgent need of your services." The Reverend looked from William to Sarah and back again, taking in their obvious travel weariness and the desperate hope in their faces. "Come in out of the cold," he said at once, stepping aside to let them enter. "Tell me what brings you here in such weather." Inside, the cabin was warm and simply furnished. The Reverend's wife appeared from the back room, a gentle-faced woman who immediately took Sarah's coat and settled her near the fire with a cup of hot tea. William explained their situation quickly. leaving out the uglier details of the gossip, but making it clear that they wanted to be married immediately, and that Sarah had no family who would be attending the ceremony. Reverend Matthews listened carefully, studying them both with an assessing gaze that missed nothing. When William finished, the Reverend was quiet for a long moment. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," he said finally. "It should not be entered into lightly or in haste. But I can see that what lies between you two is genuine. I can see it in how you look at each other, how you stand together. Still, I must ask you both, separately, if this is truly what you want." He took Sarah into the next room while William waited by the fire. In the privacy of the small bedroom, Reverend Matthews looked at her seriously. "Young woman, are you certain about this? If you are being coerced or forced in any way, you need only tell me and I will help you." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "I am certain, Reverend. I love William with my whole heart. I want to be his wife. No one is forcing me. This is my choice, freely made." The Reverend searched her face and must have found what he needed to see because he nodded. "Very well. Let us speak to the young man." He had a similar conversation with William, though Sarah could not hear what was said. When they emerged, both men looked satisfied. Reverend Matthews smiled. "I will perform the ceremony. Mrs. Matthews and I will stand as your witnesses. Do you have rings?" William shook his head, looking suddenly stricken. "I did not think about rings. I did not have time to plan this properly." Mrs. Matthews spoke up from where she was setting out what looked like wedding cake. "I have my mother's ring that she gave me before she passed. It is simple, but you are welcome to use it until you can get your own." She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a thin gold band that she pressed into William's palm. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the kindness of these strangers. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Thank you both so much. We have seen enough sorrow in this world," Mrs. Matthews said gently. "It is a joy to help love triumph when we can." They gathered in the small front room of the cabin, Sarah and William standing before the Reverend while Mrs. Matthews watched with damp eyes. The ceremony was simple and traditional, the words worn smooth by centuries of use, but no less powerful for their familiarity. William's hand was steady as he held Sarah's, his voice strong and certain as he repeated his vows. When it was Sarah's turn, she looked into William's green eyes and promised to love and cherish him, to stand beside him through whatever came, for as long as they both lived. She meant every word with a conviction that came from the deepest part of her soul. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, William kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget the cold, the hardship, the uncertain future. In that moment, there was only the two of them and the promises they had just made. Mrs. Matthews insisted they stay for a meal and rest before attempting the journey back. She fed them venison stew and fresh bread, and the wedding cake she had set out, which turned out to be a spice cake she had baked just that morning for no particular reason, except that she had felt moved to do so. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said with a knowing smile. As they ate, Reverend Matthews offered practical advice about marriage and about making a life together in this hard country. He also suggested that William and Sarah stay in Silver Cliff for the night at the boarding house down the street, given how late in the day it was and how tired they both were from the morning's dramatic events. William looked at Sarah questioningly, and she nodded. The thought of riding back through the dark and cold was exhausting, and besides, she found herself suddenly shy about what would come next, this first night as husband and wife. Reverend Matthews directed them to the boarding house and refused any payment for the ceremony beyond a promise that they would name their first child after him or his wife, depending on whether it was a boy or girl. William shook his hand gratefully, and Sarah hugged Mrs. Matthews. overwhelmed by the generosity these people had shown them. The boarding house was clean and respectable, run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, whose late husband had come from China to work the mines, and who now made her living housing travelers. She asked no questions when William explained that he and Sarah were newly married and needed a room for the night. She simply nodded and led them upstairs to a small but comfortable room with a real bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the mountains. When Mrs. Chen left them alone, closing the door softly behind her, Sarah found herself suddenly uncertain. She and William had never been truly alone together before, not like this, with the sanctioned privacy of marriage between them. She stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, acutely aware of William's presence behind her. "Sarah," William said quietly. She turned to face him. He stood by the door, still wearing his coat, looking as uncertain as she felt. "I want you to know that there is no rush for anything. I know this day has been overwhelming. We can just rest tonight if that is what you prefer." The kindness in his words, the patience and understanding, made Sarah love him even more. She crossed the room to him and took his hands in hers. "I am not afraid," she said truthfully. "I am your wife now, William. I want to be your wife in every way." Something heated in his gaze, but he remained gentle as he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her slowly, thoroughly, until she was breathless and clinging to him. What followed was tender and sometimes awkward and occasionally painful, but it was also beautiful in its own way, this learning of each other, this joining of their lives in the most intimate manner possible. William was patient and caring, and when Sarah cried, he held her and kissed away her tears and told her she was the most precious thing in his world. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts while the winter night deepened outside and the fire in the small stove burned low. Sarah rested her head on William's chest, listening to his heartbeat, marveling at how much her life had changed in the span of a single day. This morning she had been exiled and alone. Tonight she was a wife, held in the arms of a man who loved her enough to chase her down and offer her his whole future. "What will we do now?" Sarah asked quietly. "About my aunt and uncle, about where we will live." William ran his fingers through her loose hair, the gesture soothing. "Tomorrow we will ride back to Westcliff. I will speak to your aunt and uncle and explain that we are married, that you are my wife and under my care now. I will collect whatever belongings of yours they are willing to give us, though I suspect they will not be happy about this turn of events." "They will be furious," Sarah said. "They will say terrible things about both of us." "Let them," William said calmly. "Their words cannot change what is between us. As for where we will live, I still have my job at the Silver Star Ranch for now, and there is a small cabin on the property that the foreman said I could use once I was ready to settle down. It is not much, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it will be ours. We can stay there while I finalize the purchase of the land and start building our own place." Sarah absorbed this, picturing a life at the ranch, a small cabin they could make into a home. It sounded perfect, infinitely better than the cold, judgmental household of her aunt and uncle. "When will we move to the land you are buying?" "Spring, most likely," William said. "I need to make the final payment and get the deed recorded, and then we will need to build a house before winter comes again. It will be rough living for a while, Sarah. I will not lie to you about that. But I will work as hard as I can to make it good for you." "I am not afraid of hard work," Sarah said firmly. "I grew up on a farm in Kansas. I know how to tend a garden and preserve food and care for animals. I can sew and cook and manage a household. We will build this life together, William. You do not have to carry the whole burden alone." William tightened his arms around her. "I do not deserve you," he murmured. "Yes, you do," Sarah said. "You deserve happiness just as much as anyone. We both do." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Sarah slept more peacefully than she had in weeks, despite everything, because she was finally exactly where she belonged. They woke early the next morning to pale sunlight filtering through the frost-covered window. William kissed Sarah awake, and they dressed quickly in the cold room. Mrs. Chen fed them a simple breakfast of porridge and coffee, and then they were on the road again, riding south back toward Westcliff. The conversation they needed to have with Sarah's aunt and uncle loomed over them like a thundercloud, but Sarah felt strangely calm. She was married now. Whatever happened, she would not be going to St. Louis. She would not be separated from William. That certainty gave her strength. They reached Westcliff just after noon. The town looked just as it had the day before, snow-covered and windswept, but everything felt different to Sarah now. She was no longer a rejected niece being sent into exile. She was a married woman with a husband who loved her and a future to build. William rode directly to her aunt and uncle's house, a neat clapboard structure on the respectable side of town. He helped Sarah down from the horse, and they walked together to the front door. William knocked firmly. Sarah's aunt opened the door, and her expression shifted rapidly from surprise to confusion to anger as she recognized them. "Sarah," she said coldly, "what are you doing here? You were supposed to be halfway to Denver by now." "May we come in, Mrs. Downing?" William asked politely but firmly. "We have something important to discuss with you and your husband." Sarah's aunt looked like she wanted to refuse, but her ingrained sense of propriety would not allow her to turn away visitors on her doorstep where the neighbors might see. She stepped aside stiffly and let them enter. "Robert," she called toward the back of the house, "you need to come here." Sarah's uncle appeared from his study, and his face darkened when he saw Sarah and William standing in his front hall. "I thought I made myself clear, young woman. You are not welcome in this house any longer. And you," he turned his glare on William, "have no business being here." "With respect, sir, I have every business being here," William said calmly. "As of yesterday afternoon, Sarah is my wife. We were married by Reverend Matthews in Silver Cliff. I have come to inform you of this fact and to collect Sarah's belongings." The silence that followed this announcement was so complete that Sarah could hear the ticking of the clock in the parlor. Her aunt's face went white and then red. Her uncle looked like he might have a fit of apoplexy. "You married her," her aunt finally choked out. "You cannot have married her. She is in my care. She is my responsibility." "She is an adult woman, madam," William said, still calm but with steel underneath, "old enough to make her own choices. She chose to marry me, and I am honored and grateful that she did. We are here as a courtesy to inform you, not to ask permission after the fact." "This is outrageous," Sarah's uncle blustered. "This is improper and inappropriate. You have stolen away a woman under our protection, a woman we were sending to proper family who could care for her correctly." Sarah spoke up for the first time, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "No one stole me, Uncle Robert. I chose this. I chose William. You were sending me away to people I do not know, treating me like a piece of furniture to be stored out of sight because gossip made me inconvenient. William offered me a real life, a real future, and I accepted." "You foolish girl," her aunt hissed. "He is a cowboy with nothing to his name. You will end up in poverty and disgrace." "I would rather have poverty with a man who loves and respects me than comfort in a house where I am treated as a burden and a shame," Sarah said, feeling the truth of the words as she spoke them. "I am grateful for the home you gave me after my parents died, truly I am, but I will not let you dictate my entire future based on lies and gossip." Her uncle's face was nearly purple now. "Get out," he said through gritted teeth. "Get out of my house. You have made your choice, so live with it." Do not come crawling back when reality sets in and you realize what a mistake you have made." "I will not," Sarah said quietly. "May I go upstairs and get my things?" "Take what you can carry and nothing more," her aunt said coldly. "You have 5 minutes." Sarah climbed the stairs to the small room that had been hers for 3 years. She moved quickly, gathering her few dresses, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the quilt her grandmother had made. Everything fit into her carpetbag with room to spare. Her whole life in this house, compressed into one small bag. The realization was both sad and liberating. When she came back downstairs, William was waiting in the hall, standing tall and impassive while her aunt and uncle glared at him from a distance. He took the carpetbag from her and offered her his arm. Together they walked out of the house and did not look back. Only when they were on the street did Sarah allow herself to breathe fully. "That was horrible," she said quietly. "I know," William said. "I am sorry they could not be happy for you, Sarah. You deserved better from them." "I have better now," Sarah said, looking up at him. "I have you." William helped her back onto his horse and they rode out of town toward the Silver Star Ranch. Sarah did not look back at Westcliff as they left. She was done looking backward. Her future was ahead of her now, unknown and uncertain but filled with possibility. The Silver Star Ranch lay in a broad valley west of town, sprawling acres of grassland and timber that supported several hundred head of cattle and more than 50 horses. The main ranch house was a large, well-built structure, and scattered around it were various outbuildings, corrals, and smaller cabins for the ranch hands. William guided his horse past all of this to a small cabin tucked against a stand of pine trees at the edge of the property. "This is it," he said, a note of apology in his voice. "I told you it was not much." Sarah looked at the cabin with its log walls and stone chimney and a small, covered porch. It looked sturdy and well-maintained, if humble. "It looks perfect," she said honestly. Inside, the cabin was indeed just 2 rooms, a main living area with a fireplace and a small bedroom barely big enough for a bed. There was a rough table and 2 chairs, a shelf for supplies, and hooks on the wall for hanging coats. The space was cold and empty, but Sarah could see the potential in it. She could picture curtains on the small windows, a rag rug on the plank floor, her mother's Bible on the shelf. "I will get a fire going," William said, moving immediately to the fireplace where wood was already laid. "And I need to go report to the foreman and let him know I am back. I should tell him about our marriage as well, make sure he is still agreeable to us staying here." "What if he is not?" Sarah asked, a flutter of worry in her chest. "Then we will figure something else out," William said firmly. "But Mr. Carson is a fair man. I have worked for him for 2 years and never given him cause for complaint. I think it will be fine." The fire caught quickly, beginning to warm the cold space. William kissed Sarah's forehead. "I will be back within the hour. Make yourself at home. This is your place now, too." After William left, Sarah spent the hour exploring the small cabin and beginning to make it feel like home. She unpacked her few belongings, spreading her grandmother's quilt over the bed in the bedroom, placing her mother's Bible on the shelf, setting the daguerreotype of her parents on the small table. She found a broom in the corner and swept the floors, clearing away the dust that had accumulated during the cabin's vacancy. She wished she had food to start preparing a meal, but the shelves were bare. William returned as promised, and his expression was relieved. Mr. Carson was surprised but congratulatory. He said, "As long as my work does not suffer, he has no objection to my wife living here with me. In fact, his wife wants to meet you properly. She said she will send some supplies over to help us get started." Sarah sagged with relief. "That is wonderful. I was so worried." "I told you it would be fine," William said, pulling her into his arms. "We are going to be all right, Sarah, better than all right." Over the next few weeks, they settled into their new life together. William worked long days at the ranch, caring for the cattle and horses, mending fences, and doing the 1,000 tasks that kept a working ranch running through the winter. Sarah made the cabin into a home, adding small touches whenever she could. Mrs. Carson, the ranch owner's wife, was true to her word and provided them with basic supplies, as well as offering Sarah occasional work helping with washing and mending, which brought in a little extra money. The other ranch hands were initially curious about the new bride who had appeared so suddenly, but William's steady reputation served them well. Most of the men were polite and respectful, and a few even became friendly, stopping by the cabin occasionally to share news or bring Sarah rabbits or birds they had hunted. Sarah discovered that she loved the rhythm of ranch life, the simple satisfaction of keeping house and caring for William, the quiet evenings by the fire when they would talk about their days or sit in comfortable silence. William was tender and attentive as a husband, always thoughtful of her comfort and happiness, and Sarah found that marriage suited her far better than she had ever imagined it could. In late February, William rode into town and completed the purchase of the land he had been saving for. He came home with the deed in his hand and a grin on his face that Sarah had never seen before, pure joy and pride. "It is ours," he said, sweeping her up and spinning her around the cabin. 160 acres of our own land, Sarah, our own future. When can we go see it?" Sarah asked, breathless and laughing. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds," William said. "I want to show you everything, plan where we will build the house, figure out where to put the barn and the corrals. I want you to see it the way I see it, full of possibility." They rode out the next morning, taking advantage of a rare, mild day. The property was everything William had described and more. The valley was sheltered and beautiful, the creek running clear and cold even in winter, the meadow dormant now but easy to imagine in full summer bloom. Sarah could picture their house here, maybe on the slight rise above the creek where they would have a view of the mountains. She could imagine children playing in the meadow, horses grazing in the pasture, a garden behind the house bursting with vegetables. "What do you think?" William asked anxiously, watching her face. "I think it is the most beautiful place I have ever seen," Sarah said truthfully. "I think we are going to be very happy here, William." The relief and joy in his expression made her heart swell. He pulled her close and kissed her there on their own land, under the wide Colorado sky, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice that frozen morning at the stage station. This was where she belonged, with this man, building this life. They spent the rest of the winter and early spring planning their house and saving every penny they could. William continued working at the Silver Star while Sarah took on more work from Mrs. Carson and some of the other ranch families, doing mending and laundry and occasionally helping with childcare. The work was hard but honest, and every dollar they earned went into the jar they kept hidden under a loose floorboard in the cabin, their building fund growing slowly but steadily. In April, when the snow had mostly melted and the ground had thawed enough to work, William gave his notice at the Silver Star. Mr. Carson was sorry to lose him but understood, and he offered to help with the house raising when the time came. Over the next weeks, William spent every daylight hour on their property, cutting timber and hauling rock, preparing the site for their house. Sarah helped when she could, and on weekends some of the men from the Silver Star would ride over and lend a hand. By late May, the framework of their house stood on the rise above the creek. It would not be large, just 3 rooms on the main floor and a loft above, but it was solidly built and it was theirs. Sarah spent her days helping with the construction and planning the garden she would plant. At night, she and William would return to the cabin at the Silver Star, exhausted and dirty but filled with a sense of accomplishment. It was during one of those nights in early June that Sarah realized her monthly courses were late. She had been too busy and tired to notice at first, but when she counted back the weeks, she realized it had been nearly 2 months. Her heart began to pound. She waited a few more days to be certain, and when the nausea started in the mornings, she knew. She told William one evening after supper, unable to keep the secret any longer. He had been telling her about the progress on the roof when she simply blurted it out. "William, I think I am with child." He froze mid-sentence, his eyes going wide. "You think? Sarah, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," she said, her hands trembling. "I am nearly 2 months late, and I have been sick every morning this week." William set down his cup very carefully and then crossed the room to kneel in front of her chair. He took her hands in his expression almost reverent. "A baby," he said softly. "Sarah, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy," William laughed, a sound of pure wonder. "Sarah, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and amazed and more grateful than I can possibly express. You have given me everything, and now this. A child, our child." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I am terrified too," she admitted, "but also excited. I want this, William. I want our family." William pulled her down into his arms and held her like she was something infinitely precious and fragile. "I will take care of you," he promised. "Both of you. I swear it." The pregnancy added new urgency to finishing their house. William worked even longer hours, determined to have them moved into their own place before the baby came in the late fall. Sarah continued to help as much as she could, though William began to insist she rest more as the summer heat intensified and her body began to change. By August, the house was finished enough to move into. There were still details to complete, windows that needed trim and a porch that needed railing, but the main structure was sound and weatherproof. They spent a full day moving their few belongings from the cabin at the Silver Star to their new home, and that first night in their own house, sleeping in their own bedroom on their own land, was a moment Sarah knew she would remember for the rest of her life. As summer faded into autumn, they established their homestead. William built a small barn and corrals and purchased 3 good mares and a young stallion, the foundation of the horse breeding operation he dreamed of building. Sarah planted a fall garden and spent her days preserving food for the winter, putting up vegetables and smoking meat, preparing for the months ahead, and for the new life that was growing inside her. The baby kicked strongly now, and William would spend long minutes with his hand on her swollen belly, marveling at the feel of his child moving. They argued good-naturedly about names. William wanted to honor the promise he had made to Reverend Matthews and his wife to name the child after them. So if it was a boy, Samuel, and if a girl, Emma. Sarah agreed, liking both names and feeling it was fitting to honor the people who had helped them at the beginning of their journey together. In late October, Sarah woke in the middle of the night with pain gripping her belly. She knew immediately that the baby was coming. William rode hard to fetch the midwife from Westcliff, a skilled woman named Mrs. Murphy who had delivered half the babies in the territory. She arrived just as dawn was breaking and immediately took charge, sending William to boil water and stay out of the way. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the next night. Sarah had never known such pain, but Mrs. Murphy was encouraging, and William held her hand during the brief moments he was allowed in the room, his face white with worry. Finally, just before midnight, the baby was born. "It is a boy," Mrs. Murphy announced, placing the squalling infant in Sarah's arms. "A fine, healthy boy." Sarah looked down at her son, this tiny perfect person she and William had created, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. He had William's dark hair and her nose, and when he opened his eyes to look at her, she saw the same green as his father's. William appeared in the doorway and Mrs. Murphy waved him in. He approached the bed slowly, his eyes fixed on the baby. "Sarah," he breathed. "He is perfect. You are perfect." "Samuel," Sarah said softly. "His name is Samuel for Reverend Matthews, Samuel Turner." William reached out and touched his son's tiny hand, and Samuel immediately wrapped his fingers around William's thumb. The look on William's face in that moment was something Sarah would treasure forever. Pure love and wonder and fierce protectiveness. Mrs. Murphy stayed for 3 days, making sure Sarah was recovering properly and showing her how to care for the baby. Then she left with payment and a promise to check on them again in a few weeks. William took a week away from the ranch work to stay close to the house, helping with Samuel and making sure Sarah was resting. Those first weeks with the baby were exhausting and overwhelming, and more wonderful than Sarah could have imagined. Samuel was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he seemed to grow bigger every day. William was a doting father, spending hours just watching his son sleep, talking to him in a low voice about all the things they would do together when Samuel was older. Winter came and settled over their valley, but inside their house, there was warmth and laughter and love. Sarah would nurse Samuel by the fire while William worked on leather repairs or read aloud from the newspaper he bought in town. They celebrated a quiet Christmas, just the 3 of them, and Sarah reflected on how much had changed in a single year. Last Christmas, she had been living with her aunt and uncle, longing for William but afraid to hope for a future together. Now she was a wife and mother, living on her own land with a family she had made. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. William built his reputation as a skilled horseman, and people began to come from all over the territory to buy horses he had bred and trained. The money was never plentiful, but it was enough. They expanded the house, adding another bedroom when Sarah became pregnant again the spring after Samuel was born. Their daughter Emma arrived in January of 1878, born during a blizzard so fierce that the midwife could not make it to them in time. William delivered his own daughter with Sarah guiding him through what needed to be done. And though it was terrifying, everything went well. Emma was smaller than Samuel had been, with Sarah's blonde hair and William's green eyes, and she had a temper that kept them on their toes from the beginning. Samuel was a gentle big brother, protective and patient with his baby sister. Sarah would watch the 2 of them playing together and feel such profound gratitude that sometimes it brought her to tears. This was the life she had chosen that frozen morning in Westcliff when she said yes to William's desperate proposal. This was what she had gained by refusing to accept the exile her aunt and uncle had imposed. She rarely thought about her aunt and uncle anymore. She had seen them occasionally in town over the years, but they never acknowledged her, never made any attempt at reconciliation. It had hurt at first, but as time passed and her own family grew, Sarah found she did not need their approval or their presence in her life. She had built something better, something true. In the spring of 1879, William received word that the Silver Star Ranch was being sold. Mr. Carson was retiring and moving back east to be near his daughter. Before he left, he came to visit William and Sarah, bringing a gift. It was a pair of fine breeding horses, a mare and a stallion, along with a note that explained that William had been the best hand he had ever employed, and this was a thank you for years of loyal service. The gift transformed their operation. Within 2 years, they had a thriving business breeding and selling horses, with a reputation that reached across Colorado and into the neighboring territories. They built a bigger barn and more corrals, and William hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. Sarah managed the household and the business accounts, proving to have a sharp head for numbers and organization. More children came. A third son they named Robert in 1880, and another daughter, Grace, in 1882. Their house was full of noise and laughter and the organized chaos of a large family. Samuel grew tall and serious, a natural with horses like his father. Emma was spirited and fearless, always climbing trees or racing her pony across the meadow. Robert was quiet and thoughtful, always asking questions about how things worked. Grace was still a baby, but already showing signs of being the peacemaker of the family. In the summer of 1883, Sarah was working in the garden when she heard a familiar voice call her name. She looked up and was shocked to see Mrs. Chen, the boarding house owner from Silver Cliff, walking toward her with a smile on her weathered face. "Mrs. Turner," Mrs. Chen said warmly, "I hope you do not mind the surprise visit. I was traveling through the area and thought I would stop to see how you and your husband were doing." Sarah was delighted. She invited Mrs. Chen in and insisted she stay for supper. That evening, with all the children gathered around the table and William laughing at something Samuel said, Mrs. Chen looked around with satisfaction. "I remember when you two came to my boarding house," she said. "So young and scared, but so clearly in love. I wondered then if it would last, if the hardship of this life would break what you had. But I can see now that you have thrived. You have built something beautiful here." Sarah reached over and took William's hand across the table. "We have been blessed," she said simply. "It has not always been easy, but it has always been worth it." William squeezed her hand, his eyes warm with all the love and history between them. "Best decision I ever made was riding after you that morning," he said. "Best decision you ever made was agreeing to come back with me." "The only decision I could have made," Sarah said. "You were right, William. I belonged with you. I still do." Mrs. Chen stayed for 2 days, and when she left, she hugged Sarah tightly and told her to hold fast to what she had built. Sarah promised she would. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. There were harsh winters and dry summers, sick animals and crop failures, injuries and illnesses. But there were also births and weddings, good harvests and successful horse sales, moments of pure joy that made the struggles worthwhile. Samuel grew into a fine young man, steady and reliable, and when he was 20, he married a sweet girl named Alice from a neighboring ranch. They built their own small house on the far side of the Turner property, and Samuel worked alongside his father, learning everything William could teach him about breeding and training horses. Emma, true to her spirited nature, shocked everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to train as a teacher. She went to Denver for school and came back 2 years later with a certificate and a determination to open a school in the valley. With William and Sarah's help, she did exactly that, teaching children from all the surrounding ranches in a one-room schoolhouse they built near the main road. Robert turned out to have a gift for mechanics and engineering. He left at 19 to work for the railroad in Pueblo, but he came home often, always full of stories about the changing world beyond their valley. Grace, the baby of the family, was still young, only 9 years old, but already showing signs of inheriting her mother's practical nature and her father's way with animals. In the spring of 1891, nearly 14 years after that frozen morning when Sarah had been sent away and William had followed to bring her back, they received an unexpected visitor. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing supper when Emma came running from the schoolhouse. "Mother," Emma said breathlessly, "there is a woman in town asking after you. She says she is your aunt." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "My aunt, are you certain?" "That is what she told Mr. Peterson at the general store. He told her where to find our property. She might be on her way here now." Sarah sat down heavily, her mind racing. She had not seen or spoken to her aunt in 14 years. What could possibly bring the woman here now? William came in from the barn and immediately sensed something was wrong. When Sarah explained, his face hardened. "If she comes here causing trouble or upsetting you, I will send her away," he said firmly. "No," Sarah said slowly. "If she has come all this way, she must have a reason. I will hear what she has to say." They did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, a hired wagon appeared on the road leading to their property. Sarah watched from the porch as it drew closer, her hands clenched in her apron. William stood beside her, solid and protective. The wagon stopped and an elderly woman climbed down stiffly. It took Sarah a moment to recognize her aunt. She had aged dramatically, her hair gone completely white, her face lined and thin. She looked frail in a way Sarah had never seen before. "Aunt Margaret," Sarah said carefully as the woman approached. Her aunt stopped a few feet away, looking up at Sarah on the porch. For a long moment neither woman spoke. Then her aunt said, "You look well, Sarah, prosperous." "We have been fortunate," Sarah said, not willing to give more than that. Her aunt glanced around, taking in the well-maintained house, the barn and corrals, the signs of a successful working ranch. "I heard in town that you have built quite a life here. 4 children," they said. "A thriving horse ranch." "We have worked hard," William said, speaking for the first time. His tone was not hostile, but it was far from welcoming. Aunt Margaret looked at him, and something like regret passed over her face. "I owe you both an apology," she said abruptly. "I owe you more than that, but I do not imagine you will accept anything else from me." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Why are you here, Aunt Margaret?" "Your uncle passed away 3 months ago," her aunt said. "Heart failure. Since then, I have been thinking about my life, about the choices I made. I treated you terribly, Sarah. I let gossip and pride dictate my actions, and I sent away a good girl who had done nothing wrong. I destroyed any chance of a relationship with you out of stubbornness and misplaced propriety." Tears were running down the old woman's face now. "I have no children of my own. No family left except some distant cousins who barely remember my name. I am alone, and it is my own fault. I came here today not to ask for your forgiveness because I do not deserve it, but to tell you that I was wrong. About everything. You made the right choice that day. This man," she gestured at William, "he gave you a good life. He loved you enough to fight for you. I should have seen that then. I should have been happy for you instead of being so concerned with what the neighbors thought." Sarah did not know what to say. All the anger and hurt she had carried for years seemed suddenly insignificant in the face of this broken old woman. "Uncle Robert is dead?" she asked quietly. "Yes, he died bitter and angry, full of regrets he never voiced. I do not want to die the same way. So I came to say I am sorry and to see with my own eyes that you are happy. I can see that you are. That will have to be enough." Sarah looked at William, and he gave her a small nod, leaving the decision to her. She took a deep breath. "Would you like to come inside, Aunt Margaret? Meet your great-nieces and nephews. Perhaps stay for supper." Her aunt looked shocked. "You would allow that, after everything?" "I am not the scared girl you sent away 14 years ago," Sarah said. "I am a woman with a family and a life I have built through my own choices. I can afford to be gracious. Besides, whatever happened in the past, you are still my family. My mother was your sister. She would want me to offer you kindness." Aunt Margaret began to cry in earnest then, and Sarah came down from the porch and awkwardly embraced the woman who had once sent her into exile. It felt strange but also right, like closing a chapter that had been left unfinished for too long. That evening was surreal. Aunt Margaret sat at their table and met all four of Sarah's children, exclaiming over how tall Samuel had grown, and how pretty Emma was, and how much Robert looked like Sarah's father, and how sweet little Grace seemed. She listened to stories about the ranch and the horses and the school Emma had started, and for the first time in 14 years, Sarah saw genuine warmth in her aunt's face. When it was time for Aunt Margaret to leave, she pulled Sarah aside. "I am staying at the boarding house in Westcliff for a few more days before I return to Denver. I have moved there to be closer to a friend. If you would be willing, I would like to visit again tomorrow. I would like to know you better, Sarah. I would like to try to make amends, even though I know I can never fully repair what I broke." Sarah considered this. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect herself from potential hurt. But another part, the part that had grown through years of building a life with William and raising children and surviving hardships, that part knew that holding on to old anger only hurt herself. "You can visit tomorrow," Sarah said. "But I will not pretend the past did not happen, Aunt Margaret. If we are to have any kind of relationship, it must be built on honesty." "I would not want it any other way," her aunt said. Over the next 3 days, Aunt Margaret visited several times. She and Sarah talked about the past, about Sarah's parents, about the years Sarah had lived in her aunt's house. They talked about the gossip that had led to Sarah being sent away, and Aunt Margaret admitted that she had known even then that the rumors were false, but she had been too proud to go against public opinion. She had chosen reputation over family, and she had regretted it ever since. The conversations were not easy, and there were moments of anger and tears on both sides, but by the time Aunt Margaret left to return to Denver, something had shifted. Sarah would never forget what had happened, but she found that she could forgive. For her own sake more than her aunt's, she could let go of the old hurts and move forward. Aunt Margaret returned to Denver but wrote letters regularly after that. She never asked for money or help, just news about the children and the ranch. Sarah wrote back, sharing the ordinary details of their lives. When Aunt Margaret died 2 years later, she left Sarah a small inheritance and a letter expressing one final time how proud she was of the life Sarah had built and how sorry she was for ever trying to prevent it. Life continued its steady march forward. More years passed. Samuel and Alice had 3 children of their own, giving William and Sarah grandchildren who filled the house with noise and joy. Emma married a teacher from Denver and moved to the city, though she visited often. Robert came home from Pueblo and announced he was going to start a freight business, hauling goods between the mining towns and the railroad. Grace grew into a beautiful young woman who had inherited her mother's practical nature and her father's quiet strength. William's hair went gray at the temples, and Sarah found lines around her eyes that had not been there before, but they aged together, side by side, just as they had promised each other they would. They still worked the ranch, though Samuel had taken over most of the day-to-day operations. They still sat together by the fire in the evenings, still talked about everything and nothing, still reached for each other in the night. On a morning in late spring of 1897, 20 years after that frozen morning in Westcliff, when their life together had truly begun, Sarah woke early and went out to sit on the porch. The sun was just rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The valley was waking up around her, birds singing, horses whickering in the corrals, the creek running swift with snowmelt. William came out and sat beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the day begin. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Riding after me that morning, Taking on a penniless woman with nothing but a carpetbag and a bad reputation, William looked at her like she had asked if the sun might rise in the west tomorrow. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You were never penniless, Sarah. You brought me everything that matters. You brought me love and partnership and family. You brought me this life. If I could go back and do it all again, the only thing I would change is that I would have asked you to marry me sooner." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the absolute certainty of his presence beside her. "I am glad you followed me," she said. "I am glad you told me to come back. You were right. I did belong with you, I always have." "Always will," William added, wrapping his arm around her. They sat there as the sun climbed higher and the day grew brighter around them. Two people who had chosen each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded anything they could have imagined. The past was settled, forgiven where it needed to be, remembered where it mattered. The present was full and rich and good. The future was uncertain, as all futures are, but they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of Grace getting breakfast ready and Samuel's eldest son running through the hall. Soon the day would demand their attention, pulling them into the rhythms of ranch life and family obligations. But for this moment, they had peace in each other and the profound satisfaction of knowing they had done it right. They had chosen love over convenience, courage over conformity, and in doing so they had created something beautiful and lasting. Sarah thought about the girl she had been at 22, standing on that frozen platform with exile looming before her, and she wished she could reach back through time and tell that frightened young woman not to worry. Tell her that the cowboy riding hard through the dawn was bringing her salvation. Tell her that saying yes to him would be the best decision she ever made. Tell her that the life ahead, though hard, would be so much better than anything she could imagine in that moment of despair. But that girl was gone, transformed through 20 years of living into the woman Sarah was now. And this woman had no regrets, no second thoughts, no lingering what-ifs. This woman knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly who she belonged with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. William squeezed her shoulder gently, and Sarah turned to kiss his weathered cheek. No words were needed. After 20 years, they could communicate entire conversations with a glance, a touch, a moment of shared silence. The sun continued its climb into the Colorado sky, spreading light across their valley, their land, their home. And Sarah Turner, formerly Sarah Dalton, the girl who had been sent away in winter and the woman who had come back when a cowboy asked her to, felt nothing but gratitude for every single choice that had led her to this place, this moment, this life. Years continued to unfold like pages in a beloved book. Samuel took over the ranch completely when William's back began to trouble him too much for the heavy work, though William still spent hours training young horses and advising on breeding decisions. Emma's school flourished, educating 2 generations of Valley children. Robert's freight business grew so successful he opened offices in 3 towns. Grace married a veterinarian and they settled on a small ranch just 5 miles down the valley, close enough for frequent visits. More grandchildren came, and then great-grandchildren. The house that William and Sarah had built was expanded again and again, adding rooms to accommodate family gatherings that sometimes included 30 or more people. The horse operation became one of the most respected in Colorado, and buyers came from as far away as Texas and Wyoming to purchase Turner horses. Through it all, William and Sarah remained the steady center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They celebrated their 25th anniversary, then their 30th, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known anything but the love and stability their marriage represented. On their 35th anniversary in 1912, the whole family gathered for a celebration. There were speeches and toasts, and Samuel presented his parents with a photograph album documenting their life together, pictures spanning 3.5 decades. Sarah and William sat side by side on the porch, looking through the album while the party continued around them. "We did good, did we not?" William said softly, looking at a picture of them surrounded by their 4 children taken 10 years earlier. "We did better than good," Sarah said, her eyes damp. "We did extraordinary." That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, William and Sarah lay together in the bedroom they had shared for 35 years. William's hair was completely white now, his face deeply lined, but his green eyes were still bright and clear. Sarah's blonde hair had faded to silver, and her hands were marked with age spots and arthritis, but she still moved with grace, and her smile could still light up a room. "I love you," William said, as he had said thousands of times over the years. "From that first day I saw you in the ranch yard, I loved you. Every single day since has only made me love you more." "I love you too," Sarah said, settling against his shoulder in the position that had become second nature over decades. "Thank you for following me, William. Thank you for not letting me go. Thank you for coming back," William said. "Thank you for choosing me." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other as they had been for 35 years. 2 lives so completely intertwined that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. William Turner passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1915 at the age of 63. Sarah was beside him when he went, holding his hand, whispering that she loved him and that it was all right to rest now. The grief was profound, but it was softened by the certainty that they had used their time together well, that they had built something that would outlast them both. Sarah lived another 7 years, surrounded by family, still sharp and engaged with the world despite her age. She spent her days working in her garden, playing with great-grandchildren, and writing down the story of her life for future generations who might wonder how it all began. She wrote about growing up in Kansas and losing her parents and coming to live with her aunt and uncle in Colorado. She wrote about meeting a green-eyed cowboy who made her laugh and dream of possibilities. She wrote about being sent away in winter, standing on that frozen platform believing her life was over. And she wrote about William riding after her, about his simple words that changed everything. "Come back. You belong with me." She wrote about their wedding in a small cabin in Silver Cliff, about the kindness of strangers who became friends, about building their ranch and raising their children, and surviving every challenge that came their way through love and partnership and stubborn determination. When Sarah Dalton Turner died in 1922 at the age of 67, she was surrounded by 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. She was buried beside William on a hill overlooking their valley, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. The ranch continued under Samuel's management and eventually passed to his sons, staying in the Turner family for 3 more generations. Emma's school educated children until 1945 when consolidated schools were built and one-room schoolhouses became obsolete. Robert's freight business evolved into a trucking company that still operates today. Grace's children became veterinarians and ranchers and teachers, spreading across Colorado but always returning for holidays and reunions. The story of William and Sarah became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, a testament to the power of choosing love over convenience, courage over conformity, action over acceptance. Their great-great-grandchildren grew up hearing about the winter morning when Sarah was sent away, and the cowboy who followed to bring her back, and they understood that they owed their existence to that moment of brave decision, to two young people who refused to let circumstance dictate their destiny. The house William and Sarah built still stands in the valley where Grape Creek runs down from the mountains, though it has been modified and modernized over the decades. The meadow still floods gold with wildflowers in summer. The mountains still rise stark and beautiful against the endless sky. And on the hill where William and Sarah rest together, their headstones side by side, visitors still come sometimes, drawn by the story, wanting to pay respects to two people who lived ordinary lives in extraordinary ways. Their legacy was not wealth or fame or public achievement. Their legacy was love, sustained across decades and passed down through generations. Their legacy was the proof that one moment of courage, one decision to fight for what matters, can ripple forward through time in ways impossible to measure or predict. Sarah had been right when she wrote in her memoir that the life she built with William was extraordinary. Not because it was easy or glamorous or filled with grand adventures, but because it was real and hard and earned through daily choices to honor their promises to each other. They had started with nothing but love and determination, and they had built something that lasted, something that mattered, something that proved worthwhile every single day they had together. And in the end, that was everything.